Hello and welcome back to the Elite Football Show. My name is Hader and I'm your host as usual today. I've got a fantastic podcast today with the boys from Man Marking Pod. I've got Dan Reed, Ryan Pulford, two of the three because we haven't got the third member here. But boys, how are you doing today and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us, Hader. Thanks for having us on, mate. I just noticed on your intro thing, you've got Liverpool lifting the title at the end there, which must be painful for you.
Everyone says this. It's so painful. My brother's an Arsenal fan, so he did it, and I said to him, "Why are you doing this?" And he said, "Liverpool won the league." And so every time I watch it, it's it's a bit painful. I can't lie to you.
You did get the Watford goal in there though against them, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. It's a bit of give and take, isn't it? And I've also got Rob Blanchette, who's become a really, really good friend of the podcast. Absolutely great guy, and also very experienced in this field as well. So, Rob, welcome back. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks, Hader. How are you, mate?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm excited because this is something a little bit different. It's something which I think doesn't get spoken about maybe enough. There is a bit more talk about it. I actually had a lot of really, really lovely DMs yesterday when I posted out saying we were doing this. A lot of people saying how close it is to their heart. A lot of people saying how that this is a topic which should be spoken about more so. I'm really, really excited. But let's just start with the podcast that you guys are doing. I'll start with you, Dan, and just tell the listeners a bit more about Man Marking Pod and what the vision was or the purpose of it was when you set it up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we started back in, I think the first interview we did was in March. First episode came out in April. It basically came out of Ryan and I and Ant, the other lad who's involved, have been friends for a long time. We're all massive football fans. And I had a little bit of a difficult breakup at the back end of last year, which sort of put me into a bit of a dark place. And it's kind of some of the issues that I've been dealing with for a long time kind of came to a head. And when I kind of dealt with all that sort of stuff, one of the things I wanted to do was to try and use it to have a positive to come out of it. So I spoke to Ryan and to Ant, and I said, look, I've had this idea about doing a football podcast to be sort of linked in with mental health. And we basically talked around the table a little bit, had a few little chatter, and I think we went to the pub probably to do it. And then came up with the idea of us talking to people who are kind of within the game, players, managers, coaches, about their experiences of mental health, to try and encourage other men who were listening to be more comfortable themselves talking about mental health. I mean, we had to look at some statistics, and the same sort of demographic of people who go to Premier League football matches are the same demographic of people that are dying from suicide in this country. And I thought, well, that can't be a coincidence. So the people that need to hear this conversation, the people who need to hear that information, are probably football fans. There's probably a high chance they're football fans. So they had to use football as that vehicle to sort of start that conversation.
That's absolutely fascinating. I didn't really actually realize that the demographic was so similar. I mean, Ryan, what's the response been to you guys setting up the podcast? Because we actually met each other through work. That's how this is all happening. Yeah. I started a job and Ryan was at a partner company and we built up a really good relationship. I told him about my podcast, told him about yours, and we finally found, sort of synergy. But has the response been so positive? And because I've seen you guys have been doing really well, really successful at the moment.
It's been probably the biggest surprise because it coincided us with starting the podcast that coronavirus happened, and we thought, is it gonna sort of break us? And it probably made us, because at the time we ended up doing tons of interviews. We were so surprised, A, by the response from people listening, but B, by the people willing to come on and share the story, which I think for us was the sort of the biggest part of it, of getting it off the ground. We thought, are people going to want to speak to three lads from the Wirral who no one's heard of, that we want them to open up about maybe stuff that's really close to the heart? And to be honest with you, they have done. And I think that's why people have resonated with it so well, because it does seem genuine. And it is genuine. So, yeah, we've been taken back. We've had a lot of people DM us, a lot of people say thank you. And even the viewing numbers, I mean, we're not Joe Rogan, but we're certainly impressed by that. And at least one person's listening to us, let alone the people that we do have listened to us. So, yeah, made up so far with the response, and long may it continue.
That's fantastic. Amazing work you guys are doing. And Rob, I'm going to bring you in here because obviously you're in the industry. Talk to me a little bit more about what you've seen sort of being on the inside, because there is a lot of talk that things are changing, but I think there's still maybe a little bit of a stigma attached to it?
Yeah, there's still a huge amount of stigma attached to mental health, especially when we talk about football and football fans and across the board. It's the kind of never-ending subject. We've started to kind of have discussions about it, and it's great that you guys have got your podcast and you're talking freely about these things. But as we see from whether it be from social media feedback or just talking to fans in general, there is still this kind of big question mark over what mental health is. What does it constitute? How does it affect whether it be a footballer or a football fan? And it's interesting, obviously, that you mentioned the age demographic, because this is obviously what we've found is that it really is a huge stress for guys of our age groups. It's a topic that needs talking about, and there's certainly been more discussion now in the last, say, 2 or 3 years about the subject, but it's something that we still need to keep chipping away at. We still need to keep talking about.
Yeah, it's fantastic points. I mean, look, I'll be open about this. I've been out of a job since March. Obviously, a lot of guys and girls, everyone's struggling at the moment with the pandemic. It's a completely crazy situation that none of us ever foresaw. But, it's been very difficult not having anything to get up to in the morning. Essentially, that's why I made this sort of like a full-time job. I packed my schedule so that I'm keeping myself busy. But then, there's other things that come with that. You could be enjoying what you're doing like I am, but at the end of the day, if no money's coming in and you're looking at your expenses and it's just totting up. I mean, I'm just a regular person. I'm not a football fan. And the question I want to fire to you, Dan, is me, somebody not in a footballing industry, obviously has had a few dark days here and there. But do you think that professional footballers are more susceptible, or the breeding ground is much more adverse for people with mental health?
It's a difficult one, really. I think it's kind of twofold. It's certainly an environment that's obviously very high pressured. There's a lot of things in there that could be potential trigger points for people, both kind of the pressure to succeed, the money that comes with it, and the dangers that come on the back of that. I think there's a lot of young people that when they come into it, they have to miss an enormous amount of their kind of formative years, that they'd be doing the things that we remember doing when we were sort of 15, 16, 17, 18 and enjoying, and you have to kind of give those up. And it creates a very pressurized environment, and it's environment, as you say, that could make people incredibly susceptible to having adverse mental health and ill mental health. And I do think that there is a certain level of it that comes down to not everyone is right for every environment. And what we've kind of found from the interviews is that some people that go into that environment who aren't maybe the right personality for it, or haven't been able to adapt to it the way other people have found themselves in a situation where they're tested and under a lot of pressure that you wouldn't get in other sectors of society. For people who have the right mentality or are able to go into it and adapt to it in the right way, they've certainly been able to maybe cope with it. But even people who've had long careers and enjoyed it, and wouldn't change anything about their sort of time in football. I mean, we had Guy Branston on, whose episode came out recently, who played for 20 years in the lower leagues in this country, and he had a really great career. He achieved a number of promotions and played for a lot of clubs. And even he's somebody who said there were periods where he was low and he was lonely, and he didn't feel as though he was getting support, and he found it difficult. And you think that's somebody who's would self-define himself as having a strong mentality, and that environment has put a lot of pressure on him. I don't know if it's more so than other environments, but it's certainly it's a top 0.5% environment. The pressure is going to be ramped up to the absolute extreme. So the likelihood for people to be put in positions that they wouldn't be put in other areas of life is much higher.
Yes, fantastic points. Ryan, Dan talks about, sort of at a very tender age, kids are thrust into this environment. You've spoken to a lot of players, obviously, on your podcast, but do you not think that, look, from the outside, I'm looking in and thinking, look, there's a lot of risk, but there's also a very high reward. Isn't that something which some people think it's worth putting yourself in that position to possibly become a star?
Yes and no. I think the reason there are so many kids in academies is because they are all doing that. They are all trying to be that next star. The likelihood of them making it is very small. So when you think about the amount of people that actually go into academies is a small percentage. The amount that actually get pro contracts is a small percentage, and then the amount that get pro contracts and then have a decent career is quite a small percentage. So there isn't really many other industries quite like it, whereby you would put all your eggs in the basket for such a small chance of succeeding. But I think because we have this image of what being a footballer is, because we've developed in our minds that it's the greatest job in the world. And to some people and in some regards it is, but for a lot of people it isn't. And I think it probably need to change that mentality. And I do think clubs are doing that. There is a lot more around education now. You'll see a lot more clubs with a college attached to them. You'll see a lot more clubs who make sure that the players go through some form of education. And there's actually been quite a lot of awareness. We spoke to Jordan Broadbent recently, who was a coach at Sheffield United. And he said, we made a change. And I think it was actually, he learned this from Nick Cox, who I believe is at Man United, that they needed to develop the people, not the footballer, which I think is very important, because they need to give them the greatest chance of succeeding as a person, hopefully as a footballer. But if they're not a footballer, that they can come away from Manchester United, or they could come away from Arsenal and they could say, I'm still set up for life because I've learned all these skills. And I think football never used to do that, and I think it's slowly coming to terms with that, because it just eats people up, churns them out, and I think that's the big issue.
Yeah, fantastic points, Rob. I'm going to bring you in here because maybe you can't talk about the players that you do know, but there is this sort of macho perception of what a footballer should be. Is this difficult for players to live up to in that sort of environment?
Yeah, like just to touch on what you just said there about the academy system. The academy system in England absolutely sucks. Yeah, it's about finding that one player who's going to make you a ton of money, find your next Wayne Rooney, and the other 100 kids that you take along for the ride, you just dump. And this is when we talk about mental health as a wider aspect, whether it be for younger people or older guys. The sense, the kind of, not the injustice that you feel, but obviously the journey you've been on and the rejection that you feel at a very early age can be something that you never come to terms with. So you just saying there about obviously elite players as well. These guys, when we talk about what the end product is, and that's becoming a superstar or becoming famous or rich, or all of these things. As we always say, and it sounds like a cliche, these things don't make you happy. That's not really what life's about. They can be great professional tools to actually get you somewhere and feel that you've achieved in the sport. But ultimately, it doesn't really have an impact on your mental health. Your mental health is something completely different. So football clubs are coming to terms with that, and they are starting to educate the players and the staff around that. But there's certainly still a stigma there, especially with coaching, where maybe older coaches still maybe don't grasp the concept of what we're talking about now. And it still exists in the game at the highest level. So it's something that we need to keep investigating and talking about. But it's really, really tough for the guys that we're talking about who play Premier League football or even Championship or any professional football to kind of deal with on their own, because it's a really lonely job. You're in a team, but as a footballer once said to me, you're in a team of people, but these are your competition. You compete against these people every day in training. So it's not just a team sport where you all carry the load. You have these individual pressures. So it's something that we need to keep going down this journey and this road to find answers.
Do you know what I was kind of thinking of there, Rob, when you talk about older coaches with in academies with players and stuff? One of the big things that we've kind of stumbled across as a bit of a sort of theory, almost, it's been a bit of a running theme throughout a lot of the interviews, is around, I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding, particularly probably in all sports, but I mean, football's the topic that we've spoken about the most, but about misunderstanding and conflating mentality and mental health and kind of grouping them together as the same thing. And you've seen a lot now, the advent of sports psychologists are being used a lot more in football. We had Dan Abrahams on, who's worked for Bournemouth and some other clubs as well. And he was talking about how his sort of role is very performance based. So you might have a player who's struggling with something on the pitch, and he's brought in to talk to them maybe about how to perform better. And it's not so much about making them either happier or, if they've got issues with sort of depression or anxiety or whatever it might be, it's about improving their performance on the pitch. And whilst I think that's a good step in terms of looking at that aspect of it, what we've got to make sure not to do is to think of them as the same thing. And I think they're entirely separate things. You can have a really strong mentality, but have really poor mental health at the same time. And I think those two things can coexist. And that's probably the biggest thing that we can start to learn and start to develop on.
Yeah, absolutely. They're two separate islands. And I always say this with physical injury. You know, if you've twisted your ankle and you're walking around with a hobble, people can say, well, he's got an ankle problem. That's why he's not playing well if you put someone on a football pitch. Whereas obviously we can't see into the minds of players or people. And we have a perception about someone, don't we? So like if someone has problems with mental health, we immediately perceive them to be weak.
Yeah.
And that doesn't help anyone. You know, it certainly doesn't help the person who's trying to obviously deal with their mental health. And it also doesn't help football clubs. You know, if coaches look at it from that angle, they're not getting the best from their players and their employees. So there has to be further understanding from both sides. But like you're saying, you're totally right. It shouldn't be perceived as a weakness if you want to talk about your mental health.
Yeah, I think quite the opposite. Sorry, Hayden.
No, guys, carry on. This is brilliant. I'm learning as we go along. So yeah, carry on. Jump in whenever, because this discussion is brilliant.
I think that's such an important thing that you say, Rob. I think it's redefining what strength is and redefining what weakness is. And I think what for a long time has been perceived as a weakness, which is, oh, you know, he's got a weak mentality or he's weak mentally, which is a term that we hear in football all the time. Whereas if you think about it, if somebody feels the way that you feel when you're depressed and they're still able to get up out of bed, to get themselves washed and get themselves dressed, to get in the car and drive to work or drive to training and perform, or, you know, even just get through the day, it takes an enormous amount of strength to do that. And, you know, I'm someone who, I wake up every day and I take antidepressants and I take propranolol as well for panic attacks. I do that every single day. And I get up for work and do my work and see my friends and do all the rest of it. And it takes a lot of courage and strength to do that. And I think changing that conversation and changing the way that we perceive weakness and strength is something that could do a lot of men a lot of help.
Yeah, and that's the question for society, isn't it? Because I always say that football is a reflection of society, whether you look at the fans or whether you look at the players. You know, it's the same as you just said there. You know, you get up, you take your meds, and you fight through the day. And it doesn't matter whether you're at a top Premier League club or whether you're going to the office. You know, these things affect all of us. And the stigma affects everyone, you know, and I think now we're finding in society that people are looking at mental health from a completely different angle. But it's taken 20 years to kind of get where we are here now. And the most important thing is in these kind of divided times that we don't lose that now, because it's very easy to kind of go back to old ways and think old methods and start thinking like you just said there about, you know, do we look at someone and perceive them to be weak, when talking about your problems and talking through your mental health and trying to find solutions is actually a sign of strength. So I think at the top end of the game, where we have the you know, the best psychologists and the best sports science, that's now encouraged, and certainly in our sport we see that. But that now needs to filter through into everyday life, and that the guy in the street can think exactly the same and have the same kind of support. Especially when we talk about the NHS, you know, we talk about the support on offer physically. You know, if you're ill, you get the support, don't you, in hospital? But there's still, maybe if you need to see a psychologist, there's still a year waiting list. So there's a difference in kind of outlook and outcome when we talk about mental health. It is not the same. If I broke my leg, I could go to hospital tomorrow and get it seen to, and no one would blink, and I would see a consultant later on, and it would all be a very quick process. But obviously with mental health, quite often it is an urgent process, but you're told you have to wait for a year. So there's a whole load of questions to be answered.
And I think with football as well, I think clubs could do a little bit more in regards to, if you take a player who's very injury prone, you'll often find that, or we'll get him on a pay-per-play deal, or we'll sign him in the hope that we can get 20 games out of him, or like a Jack Wilshere, we hope if we can get him anywhere near what he was. Yeah. But they often write off players who may have had a difficult time mentally, and they'll say, "Oh no, it's a risk not worth taking." So people seem to want to invest in getting people back to physical condition and a physical best, but not a mental best, which I think is quite a shame. Me and Dan have had a conversation a few times about, you have a head of nutrition, you have a physio, you have somebody who manages injuries, but a lot of these clubs, even at elite level, don't have a head of well-being, or they're only just getting introduced to them now. And I think it's it's an attitude that needs to be. Mental health is just as important as physical health, because it is, but ultimately it's not treated the same.
The question I kind of want to fire over to you, Dan, is that you touched on it about the difference between, for example, if a player goes and sees a sports psychologist because they're mentally weak, and I'm using that word in the sense of on the pitch, for example, their composure's off, or they're not able to perform to the higher levels because of that issue. But how can someone or the club differentiate between being mentally weak or having mental health problems? Because I can imagine a lot of fans would just say, oh, this person's, let's say a player's looking down, he's struggling. That could very much be mental health problems, not a weak mentality or an attitude. So how can fans be better? But then also, how can clubs be better in identifying these issues?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a difficult one, because I think even, football's a reflection of society, and I don't think even as a broader society we've kind of come to any conclusion either way as the general public. I think one of the things that you can look at is that just because somebody is playing well and performing well and has, as you say, in air quotes, a strong mentality, it doesn't mean that they don't go home and cry themselves to sleep every single night. It doesn't mean that they don't go home and shut the curtains and sit in the dark because they're too anxious to go out and speak to anybody. And those two things are entirely separate. I think that's the biggest thing we have to take on. For clubs, I think it's just as Ryan said there, they have a head of nutrition, they'll have a head of sports science, they'll have a head of analytics, they'll have a head of this and a head of that. And in there will be a sports psychologist. And the idea will be, if somebody's struggling with something, we'll send them to them. And I said, well, why don't you have a therapist? Why have we not got a counsellor in there? And you say, well, forget the football for now. Let's talk about you. How are you feeling? How are you getting on? And you think ultimately it creates an environment where people are comfortable to say if they're not feeling okay. I think the biggest problem that current footballers have, and that's current footballers of any generation, is that they don't want to talk about it, because if they say to somebody in the club, I'm feeling this way, or, I'm not feeling confident, or, my self-esteem is lacking, or whatever it might be, the way that might translate is he switched on enough to play on Saturday? Is he feeling okay? Are we going to put him in the team? And the last thing they want is to lose their place in the team. Football's a very precarious career, and you can go from being, one of the best players in the country to, not being quite up to it, the next day. I mean, you don't have to look at someone like Dele Alli and you think he's somebody who 2 or 3 years ago people were talking about, our Spurs going to be able to hold on to him. And now he can't even get in the squad. So you can see why they'd be so desperate to hold on to that position in the squad. And if there's an environment created for them to be able to say, I feel like this, and the club to understand that that's got nothing to do with their performance, that they can still perform to a high level and still do their job and still be a professional, then that's the kind of place that they need to get to.
It's a great point. Has anyone got anything to add to that?
One thing we saw that Tranmere did, our local club, which I thought was very good, is they had an app, and players had to press like a smiley face every day they came into training to say if they were sad, they were okay, they were happy. And what they wanted to achieve was, without directly asking the question, where you may not get a direct response, is to just try and monitor if they needed to pull someone to one side and say, how did you sleep last night? Is anything going on in your personal life? So as Danny said, I think you have to create the environment, because I think with anything like this, it only works if you actually genuinely care. You can't do it because you want to do it out of corporate or social responsibility. You've got to do it because I want the best for technically your employees or your players. And I think the clubs that do care will get it right. There might be some bumps in the road, but eventually they'll get it right. But the problem we have is I don't think enough people care. So the environment isn't created, and therefore people aren't spotting the signs. If Danny's touched on sports psychologists, you hear it all the time. They're brought in to help with penalties, or they're brought in to help people with the putt, about keeping that focus for that important shot that will win you the game. They're not brought in to check if what your well-being is overall. They couldn't really care as long as you score the winning goal. Yeah. So I think the second you start caring is the second you're already on the right road to doing something right. So I think it's about having the conversation, creating the environment, and then working with the players as well.
Yeah, and also
what you want us to do.
Yeah, also in football, football's about winning, not taking part. Yeah, so we quite often kind of have cliches again about football and what it actually means to fans. Ultimately, those players are on the pitch to win football matches. That's how football clubs look at it. And that's how fans look at it. And whatever someone's mental health is kind of by the by, But again, we're talking about physical health. If a player injures his knee, as I said, or as a shoulder injury or neck injury or something, fans can empathize with that. Quite often when we're talking about the mind and we're talking about how someone feels inside them, that's not something that fans often empathize with. And that's reflected in how football clubs are run. So you're right. It's about caring. And it has to be a kind of holistic answer. I always use that word of everything because it's about the sport caring. It's about fans caring. It's about people caring about one another. If you don't care about people, then you can't possibly talk about this subject. You have to have some empathy somewhere in the middle of it. And that's been, I think, the biggest challenge for football, because ultimately it's a big money business. It is all about fame and success and trophies. And the humans kind of come somewhere near the end of it. And as long as that's the case, we'll never really make progress, whether that be in football or in society.
Yeah.
I don't think it's helped by the short nature of the manager's position either. Because if a manager wasn't constantly worried about his job and therefore results driven, although I understand why it's results driven, you'd probably find an environment where if there was less chain of players and less chain of managers and the same faces in the building for year on end, you'd probably develop a tighter bunch of people who would probably want to support each other a lot more. Yeah. But it's very cutthroat industry, as we're all aware. Something that I found very interesting, which brings back to the mentality, is did you see the Last Dance documentary with Michael Jordan?
Yeah.
And the conversation and divide in there. Now, Michael Jordan did absolutely everything in his powers to win. And he didn't care who he upset along the way. And to him, he ultimately achieved his goal. He didn't do it by being a nice person. And I think sport at the elite level will always have that difficult crossroads of doing the right thing and doing the thing that's necessary to win, which, as Rob said, it needs to be a holistic approach to try and get the best of both worlds.
I've seen that. Sorry, I've seen that again with top sport. With players, that there is this mentality that you have to be a bastard, and be harder than hard, and you can step on anyone you want to win. And that's how we raise the kids. When we talk about academies and coming through, this is the kind of examples we set for them and say this is how you need to be. And what you find is a lot of those kids who have got incredible talent simply can't live like that, can't be those kind of people. And that's a really tough thing, because you see talent and it's not a case that talent gets wasted. It's just the way we're pitching it. So we're trying to tell these talented players that you have to be Michael Jordan, that you have to be that kind of, double hard person who doesn't care about emotion and is bigger than the room, everyone in it, you're the best in it. And you can't live like that. Whereas what the real truth is that most footballers are just normal people. Even at the top level, when they sit there, they've got families, they've got mates, they've got friends there at the game watching them. And that pressure of walking out, say, at an Old Trafford at our football club with 78,000 people there, either cheering your name or sometimes, tutting and booing and hissing if they're not happy. Exactly, Fellaini. Or, we've had it recently with Jesse Lingard, haven't we? It's the same thing.
Jesse's another one as well.
Jesse's spoken a lot about his mental health, obviously, recently, and that's been in the press, and there's been lots of discussions about that. But sometimes football isn't the most important thing in your world, even if you're a very well-played footballer.
I think one thing that's always worth considering as well, and as you say, the players are there to win. But ultimately, if you think about it, and that word holistic is spot on, Rob, is that if those players are happy and their well-being is taken care of, the likelihood is that they'll be better footballers, because they'll be happier, they'll be more comfortable, they'll be sleeping better, they'll be just be better people all round. They'll be happier within themselves, and the likelihood is you'll get better footballers out of that, because you'll get better people, as Ryan said.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's, as I knows that word holistic. I say it in everything, because I think it does mean everything in football, in terms of, when we talk to football clubs, we always say, what are you looking to do? And all of them say improve in every facet. That's what they want to do. They want to win on the pitch, but they want to improve their players, their lives, whether it be financially or mentally or whatever. But you've got to actually do certain things to do that. And it's interesting you just said there the word sleep, because I heard this from a top footballer recently who said, that they couldn't sleep, that they're having problems sleeping, and that was affecting their training, and it was affecting how they felt about themselves, and it was affecting their confidence and their self-esteem. and it all was about their sleep patterns.
Yeah.
Now, I think football clubs have latched onto that. I know in the last couple of years, they are testing things like sleep and stuff like that now. Whereas 2 years ago, if you'd mentioned that to a football club, they'd have gone, well, it's up to the player to go to bed on time and wake up and come into training. And it's quite often the connections were not, those dots were not being joined. And again, you can say this for all of us four sitting here. You know, if we don't get a good night's sleep, if we've got to work the next day for whatever reason and be at the top of our game, there's a good chance that we won't be at our best. So all of those things need to be taken into account. And with your mental health, things like sleeping and eating and hydration and everything that goes with it is so important.
Yeah,
it's a great point. Great, guys. I'm going to move it on to just a bit of a different direction. We've mentioned the current sort of situation. We've spoken about a few things that clubs are doing. But Ryan, I'm going to bring you into this first. How much harder was it for the previous generation compared to the current generation? Now, it's difficult to say because people, there's different challenges. Right now, there's the social media, which is horrible. The player can go on social media, and we'll talk about Maguire later, and read disgusting comments. I just want to tell a little story quickly before I ask you sort of your view. But I did a podcast recently with a Tottenham fan. Really, really lovely guy. Got a massive following. He's been doing it for 10 years. Got a very, very loyal set of supporters. Now, after each podcast, Rob knows this, I clip it up and I post it out, sort of to increase engagement, etc., etc. He said, this was his opinion. He said that the 2 years under Pochettino he'd rather have those 2 years where they didn't win anything, but it was amazing, enjoyable football. He had a connection to the club, rather than have 10 years of trophies under Jose. And the comments that he got, calling him the C word, a pedophile, all these things. I hope you die, all these sort of things. And eventually I took the video down. I mean, it got 22,500 views. I mean, it was just disgusting. And he actually deactivated. He still got Twitter. I spoke to him actually last week. He's going to come on again probably next week to talk about it. But this is someone who has a different opinion. And he's been driven off Twitter now. That's it. He's going to come on from time to time, but that's made him decide this is not for me. So this is just a normal person every day. Now, if someone walks out on the pitch and sees has a bad performance and the fans see it and they go onto Twitter and they send that sort of hate to him, it's just disgusting. So that's what the current players have to deal with. But in the past, were the dressing rooms more difficult? You've spoken to players who are a little bit older.
Yeah, I think overall it probably was harder for a previous generation, but I think sometimes it's not always a case of being harder or easier. It was different. We have to factor in all the variables, I think, and you can't always just take it at face value. I think if you picked up players back then and put them in today's game, I suppose the environment in itself is probably easier. But it's a lot more complex now, as you've touched on about social media, which I think is causing it's people making comments that they wouldn't make in person, which I think is very dangerous. So while my viewpoint is I think we're trending in the right direction, I think previously it was much more difficult to get help. And I think former generations, it wasn't so much that it was harder for them, but they would suffer in silence more, which I think has insidious implications when you don't speak up. I think touched on the word before, environment. I think the challenges are still there that used to exist, but the environment now lends itself to putting your hand up if you're struggling, and the reaction to you putting your hand up, I think, is better now than it ever has been, which I think is the biggest positive change in generations. We have spoke to a lot of footballers who said that the changing rooms, even up until the late 90s, early 2000s, were ridiculous. They were pretty much a free-for-all. Chris Iwelumo touched on turning the lights on, people throwing punches and then turning the lights on 5 minutes later. It was that type of place. So I think changing rooms have come along a lot as well. But yeah, it's not so much. I don't always like saying it's much better now than it used to be, because that implicates what we've got now is perfect. And I still don't think it is by a long stretch, but I still think it is trending in the right direction.
I think one thing that's always useful to kind of look at as a barometer is, I mean, suicide was illegal until 1961. That was when the legislation changed. So you think of the footballers that were playing in the 70s and the 80s, they'd likely have been alive when it was still a crime. So you'd have to think of what the sort of general public attitude would have been towards suicide, and then sort of more broadly mental health around that sort of time. And it's not to kind of denigrate those people or to criticize them, but the understanding just wasn't there in the same way that it is today. I mean, we do a series of episodes. We do them every other week where we look at like an example of mental health from kind of yesteryear. And a couple that we had Robin Friday, who's the winger who played for Reading for a few years, and he was a drug addict. He was an alcoholic. He had a whole host of problems that you would now call mental health problems. Whereas at the time, he was kind of known as this kind of rock star footballer. He was known as this kind of maverick and this person who and it was glorified. And whereas now you look at it and you think that was someone who probably needed some help. He needed someone to put his arm around him, and he ultimately lost his life to a heart attack from an overdose. And you think there's somebody who died in his early 30s, and he lived in an environment where nobody thought that what he was doing was a problem. Nobody thought that he needed anyone to talk to, or just needed 5 minutes for someone to say, "How are you feeling?" Because you can't be feeling that good if all you're doing all the time is taking drugs and getting drunk, because there must be something going on. If that was one of your mates now, you'd be like, "John's gone off the rails. Like, maybe someone should have a word and see if he's okay." So you'd have to look at it as like the barometer of the environment back then compared to the environment now. It's just like it's like a different world, and the sport itself is entirely different. And Ryan's right. Both eras come with their own pressures, and both eras have their own difficulties. But I do think with every generation, we get closer to what is the best environment for people. Because I do think ultimately, as Rob and Rambo said, it's about caring. And I think the more education there is, the more understanding of mental health, the more people will care. And ultimately, if people care and the heart's in the right place and the finances and the resources there, which they are in football, they will get it right. Ultimately, they'll get it right, because I think it's the best thing for the people involved.
Yeah, we had a well-known footballer at our football club called George Best, who was an alcoholic and went through the 60s as being probably one of the most famous people in the country, the fifth Beatle, everything, to English football at that time. And everything he did was on the front page of a newspaper, whether it be what he's doing with the Miss World or which pub he was in or any of that. And to this day, it's still kind of celebrated that he was this maverick who, we talk about going down the pub with George Best and having a drink with him.
On the piss with Georgie Best, yeah.
As the songs that we sing in the Stretford End for him goes. Yeah. And to this day, that is still not recognised, that he was probably suffering from some incredible mental health pressures, for him to be able to be stuck in a pub pretty much in all his spare time drinking. And he did that until he died. So that was a lifelong problem for him that was never really recognised, whether it be by society or by football, because that was who he was. That's what people expected. And I think that now, as you just said, it's changing. Certainly the barometer is changing in terms of what the expectation is for a player if they have a problem, but it's still not quite there. And what worries me is because society has gone backwards a little bit in the last 2 or 3 years, whether you look at that as being the Brexit bubble bursting, or whether it's a kind of reaction to Donald Trump or the Tories or whoever, we're seeing that we're not quite making the progress in areas that maybe we were 5 years ago, where we were thinking about these things and thinking we'd find solutions by now in 2020. And here we are, kind of still feeling like we're walking through mud rather than we're kind of getting a trot on now and kind of getting somewhere with these problems.
I think it's I think that's very true, Rob. I think, as you say, it feels as though now in 2020 we're almost further back than we were in, say, 2012. I think people used the Olympics in 2012 as a bit of a marker thing. Remember when it was great? Remember
the good old days?
Yeah, like
in 2012,
everyone was happy and getting on. We were all
coming out of recession.
Yeah, we're all moving in the right direction. Everyone's got money for beer. It'll be fine. Don't worry about it. And then we're 8 years on, and it's an absolute. You don't even want to look out the window. Do you know what I mean? And it's just. But I think, as you say, it's hoping to get to a place where we can talk about these things, and I think it relates to other sort of things as well. I mean, we've only had to look at the kind of the stuff that's been going on with the Black Lives Matter movement recently as well. There still aren't any out gay footballers at the top level either. You think what more needs to be done for us to get to an environment? And it's hard. It is really hard. It's a very complex issue, and people are complex. And I think that's the sort of the way that we go in, especially in this country where people are very much aware that they have a voice and aware that they're their opinion is allowed to be stated. But yeah, it's not perfect by any means. It is moving in the right direction. But the biggest thing, I mean, we've said this a few times, you can't rest on your laurels. You can't think the job's done. You can't think it's okay now, because the minute that you think that it's okay, it won't be okay. Yeah. Because there will always be someone who doesn't agree with that and thinks, I mean, we saw, I can't remember who it was, somebody tweeted a while ago, Ryan, I think you screenshotted and put it in the group, and I'm sure it was a former footballer who was of a certain age, had tweeted something about, are all these players coming out saying that they're feeling like this?
Oh, yeah. I remember it was as well.
Wouldn't have stood for it in our day. And then he hashtagged it game's gone, which was quite funny, to be fair. Hashtag game's
gone. Are you able to name and shame, Ryan, or is that not allowed?
Oh, it was Ian Marshall used to play up front for, I think, Everton and Leicester. Oldham, yeah.
It was proper.
He went on a bit of a rant about how everyone snowflakes.
He was proper old school. He was proper old school, like mullet and everything. You know what I mean? He was. I can remember him. Yeah, no, but look, that's individuals' opinions, isn't it? And like, I'm from the '90s in terms of when I was a kid, and I can remember the first wave of it in the '90s, where we thought the world was changing. We thought we'd solved racism. We thought we'd solved homophobia. We thought we'd got there with mental health, that people suddenly understood. And then here we are now, 30 years on. 30 years, and we haven't really made that progress. We talk about these things, but we're still talking about it in terms of the stigma that is attached to people. Whether, I'm glad you mentioned Black Lives Matter there, because I think that's another topic that kind of sits in the same framework, where people might understand what the issue is, but there's still a hell of a lot of people going, I just don't agree with it. You're marching against this thing. Oh no, I'm not into that. I don't know why you're that bothered about racism. And obviously, if you're a person of color, people then go, oh well, yeah, I get why you're bothered about it, but why are white people bothered about it? Well, it's the same issue, isn't it? You're bothered about it because you believe that it's an injustice. So I think as well with mental health, it's now trying to find whatever the next step is, and it's good that we're talking about football here, and obviously football clubs initiating progress, but it's now about education as well, and it's about teaching the Ian Marshalls of the world, who might be a little bit older and doesn't really care about it, that this is the way we're going and this is where we're taking the sport and society, and you have to come along for the ride. And I think that's the most important part of it, when we talk about all these isms about, like you said there, about there's no out gay footballers, and it's a crazy thing, isn't it? Because what we're saying is that there are no gay footballers in our sport, and it is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous, and it's a lie, and it's not true. And you talk to footballers, they will tell you what's going on in their clubs. But of course, it doesn't get reported, because it becomes more about speculation or tabloidism or whatever you want to call it. We need someone to come out and actually hold their hands up. But what happens to that player the minute they do that?
We saw what happened with Justin Fashanu, didn't we?
Justin Fashanu was, again, in the 70s, such a long time ago. We're talking 50 years ago, and look what happened to him. And he took his life in the end, but you look at that, and if there was a top class footballer today, say Lionel Messi came out and said he was gay, what would happen on every football pitch he stepped onto? The crowd would, it'd be a bloodbath, wouldn't it? We know how the crowd would react, and that would then be the story, you see. So this is the problem, I think, in society, is that we haven't solved that big question yet about how we react to someone's mental health, when they actually hold their hand up and say, no, I'm being brave here, I want to tell you what's wrong with me. Then you end up having football clubs saying, well, we're going to end your career because of it. And that's really, really tough for anyone to carry. And I don't know. I don't think we're there yet. We're going in the right direction, but it's just so much ground to cover.
I think one of the important things to always remember, and we talk about this a lot on the podcast, is about how we use language and about what language we use, and particularly when it comes to mental health. I mean, like, a basic thing is, when I mentioned there about suicide was illegal until 1961, people still refer to someone who dies from suicide as committed suicide, and that's just the standard phrase that people use. And the reason that they use it is because that's what people have always said, because it was illegal, you were committing a crime. And I think the stigma that's then attached to that, because it's a crime, and that it was a crime because it was seen as immoral, because it was like self-murder, and it obviously all links back into like religion and things like that. But ultimately, you change the language. It's really important. It's really small things, and I think people go, "Why does that really matter?" It's like when we were in school, and I don't know if you guys were the same. Everything was gay. That's gay. That I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
That's gay. That's gay. And when you're a kid, you don't really understand why that's important. But as you grow up and you think, no, it is important because you're making something that isn't a thing just by your use of language. And when it comes to things like racism and like homophobia, and we've seen it a lot with transphobia as well, it's really important, the language that we use is really important. And if someone pulls you up and says, that's not the right thing to say, people go, oh, it's PC gone mad, you can't say anything these days. Yeah. Just think about the impact that those words can have on somebody else. Because
it's exactly the same with sexism, you know, like it's exactly the same for women. We get this, especially with our sport in football, you know, we now have two very defined products in the men's game and the women's game. And obviously the women's game's come a really long way in this country over the past few years. Yeah, I still get tweeted constantly when I tweet about Manchester United's women's team. Constantly, people will be throwing derogatory comments at them via my tweets because they believe they're inferior, you know, and they look at them as not just as an inferior sporting product, but they look at them in terms of inferior just because they're women. And that's tough. If you're a woman carrying that in our sport, that's a really tough thing to get up to every day and face. You know, you want to be elite in that sport and do everything and all the training that goes with it. However, you're immediately just devalued. So again, someone would look at me saying that and they'd go, oh, you're a snowflake. And I get called a snowflake all the time on Twitter because of it, all the time. And you just accept it because that's what one demographic wants to call another at the end of the day. But these things do matter. And I actually tweeted something today, and the top of the words, I don't know if Hader read it, was words matter. Yeah, words matter. Yeah. Words really do matter. And until we get language correct, especially in English, then we're not going to make the strides forward. And in football, that, you know, those words are still not being corrected on a regular basis. They're still there, present in our society.
And I think on that, Rob, football as an organisation, as an entity, it's not very good at having them conversations. It's very awkward about having those conversations. So it leaves fans to have the conversations. And I mean, you saw this, it was about 2 years ago now when the England team was racially abused by Bulgaria. Yeah. And you've got people on the sidelines trying to follow a protocol. Nobody knows what they're doing. You can't have an algorithm to solve racism. What should have happened there is we take the players off and we refuse to play. And you've even seen that happen in the past where players are begging players who've been racially abused to stay on the pitch. I've even seen people sent off for reacting to racism. And you kind of like, hold on a minute. There's a very obvious right and wrong in all of this. It doesn't always matter because you've got an opinion that it needs to be valued, because there's sometimes a very black and white, right and wrong answer to and reaction to things. And football brushes it under the carpet and allows newspapers and fans to pick it up and discuss it. And I think football sometimes, and a lot of the large media companies should maybe take these subjects and tackle them a little bit more head on, and not just from a corporate responsibility. Let's look like we care and do a hashtag. I mean, actually have the conversation, because if not, you're just allowing people on Twitter and other places to breed hatred, and it's gone on for too long.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point that you make, because you know, we see obviously with the major media houses in the UK all addressing racism, yeah, whether it be on radio or on television, and it's a topic that's there all the time. And obviously, everyone is singing from the same song sheet, the same thing, that racism is wrong and we want to combat it and beat it. However, the proof is not in the pudding. It's not there. You know, we are still seeing racism in football stadiums, whether it be on the pitch or in the stands, whether it's the kind of inherent racism that's just there in the game with no black managers in the pyramid structure of the 92. We're still seeing that, not enough coaches or people of color. Yeah, this is still very much present, and it's all very well us having maybe the start of conversations, but if we're not having the kind of wider debates, and this is what really marries into mental health, obviously what we're talking about here today, it's really, really tough for these players. I know plenty of players that have said that if they're going to be racially abused, they're going to walk off a football pitch. We are yet to really see that in the top tier yet. We're still seeing incidents of racism, but the players have not quite actually had the courage to do it yet. But behind the scenes, they're saying to us, that's what we want to do. You know, if we suffer racism, we're going to collectively walk off together. And that's the next step. And I said this at a forum not so long ago, a year or so ago. And I said, you know, we need that now to happen. We need that to happen for someone to walk off and them to end that game and say, we are not playing. And the response was from both fans and other journalists was, yeah, but that's a kind of weak response because we have to fight it. We have to talk about it and we have to find a way. And I'm like, well, here we are all these years later. We haven't found a way yet. You know, we're 50 years on from the conversation starting. We haven't found a way yet. So first of all, you have to protest and say, no, we're not playing your sport. You know, your sponsors are not going to have their name across our shirts. We're not going to dance around for you when we're being racially abused by both the system and both by people. You know, it's a two-tier thing.
Isn't it? That there are people that I completely disagree with the idea that the players should stay on. And then when people say that, it's saying you're letting them win. It's nonsense. I don't know why this narrative's pushed. I mean, obviously you're working in the media and we've had many discussions. Obviously we had a discussion like I'm BAME, you know, you're BAME, etc. We've had discussions around this and there's obviously now a conscious effort to, for example, bring more, you know, ethnic minority and black people into the media. But I haven't seen, maybe Micah Richards is one of them, but I haven't seen many people tackle it head on, like, for example, on Sky Sports on the Soccer Saturday. I think Micah Richards did one last season, which was really well. I think it was about himself, actually, about how he's grasped the opportunity, but I haven't seen anyone tackle it. And is there this idea that even people in the media who are BAME, they're actually scared to say something so outright against it just in case they might not get another contract?
Of course. Absolutely. You know, this is still a white man's world. You know, the media houses are run by, you know, white power. You know, and this is the truth. You know, it's who I work for. So I can say that, I think, with confidence, because I feel that there is a background to that and evidence and all of that. However, if you've just scored a big job on Sky Sports and you're sat in front of a camera, you have a producer in your ear, you have a director who runs it, you know, and you have people at the top who are obviously feeding information down. So you have to be careful. You have the platform to talk about it. Obviously, you just mentioned Micah Richards there, and he has spoken about it, you know, when he's been asked about it. But it's still a very, very difficult subject to broach yourself. You know, you very rarely see a pundit who might talk about a player who would then say, oh, you know, that player, the racism that he's suffering, that might be affecting his performance. When do you ever hear a pundit say that? But that's the actual truth. That's the actual truth that's happening. But we're still not seeing that as a reflection either in the punditry or how we assess the game. And that teaches the fans a certain way. It tells the fans that this is how the sport is and these are the rules and you got to stick to them because this is how we've created this sport. And the truth is that that's the problem. You know, we have to break those rules down and actually find ways of having these conversations honestly and not just for television.
I think one really good example of that, Rob, is was anyone watching, I don't know which match it was, when I think it was the United Tottenham match, actually. Sorry to bring that up again, lads.
Gotten that.
I don't know what you're talking about, Dan.
To be honest with you, we're Tranmere fans. It's very hard for us to have any sympathy. You did whack us 6-0 last year. So
I remember Harry Maguire scored from like 30 yards as well. That's amazing.
It wouldn't be so bad. But the first 4 minutes, we had you boxed in. Had like 3 corners.
I honestly thought we were going to lose that game. Going into that
game. A yellow.
I know. But yeah, in the punditry after that game, Graham Souness, I think it was talking about how what Lamella did was very Latin. He referred to it as in terms of the way he went down. And what I thought was that interesting about that was I saw a few different reactions to that on Twitter. Some people saying it was, you know, it's stereotyping and it's old fashioned, all sorts of stuff. Filippo Clare, who's a journalist who does stuff for he's on the Guardian Football Weekly quite a lot, isn't he? And he was saying how he didn't find it offensive because he would define himself as being Latin, and he was saying that is part of our football culture. There are different football cultures and we do things in a different way. And he was saying, but the problem that he had with it was that Sky did an apology about it. Graham Souness just sat in the background like a naughty school child who'd been slapped and told to sit down, rather than just the presenter going, well, explain what you mean by that. Because Graham Souness might have said there are different football cultures and people do things in different ways. And that had been a really interesting adult and open discussion about the views he might not have had prejudiced views about that. It may have just been from his experience of playing football. People from this country and this area play differently to the way that we play. And it's not right or wrong. It's just a different way of playing. In the same way that Luke Shaw absolutely siding down Lucas Moura as he's running through, people in Latin countries might say that's a very English thing to do. Do you know what I mean? And I think rather than having an actual conversation about it, they just avoided it altogether. They just completely avoided it.
And this is why we say words matter, because I spoke about that afterwards, about that comment from Souness, and the way he framed it was the issue, not what he was saying. The context was correct. South American players or players from Latin countries will openly tell you that they will do whatever it takes to win. If they have to foul someone in the game and bring down someone on the edge of the box rather than them scoring in the last minute, and it means their team wins 1-0, they will be celebrated for it. Their fans will celebrate them and their clubs will celebrate them for it. Whereas in our country, we have this kind of high and mighty righteousness. When that happens, at least said the Luke Shaw one, Luke Shaw should have been sent off for that tackle.
Straight red.
If that had happened actually in one of the South American leagues, the player would have been celebrated for it. It would have gone, oh, well, it happens as part of the game. That's part of our game. It's more about how it's pitched. And you said that Sky apologized for it afterwards. And really what Sky need to apologize for is how things are framed. They don't need to apologize for the specific language, because the word Latin isn't racist. To describe someone being from a Latin country isn't racist. But the way that Graham was putting it across wasn't the right way to put it, because he was blaming his ethnicity for what he was doing. And that was the problem. He was saying, because he's from that kind of country, that's why he kind of went down easy. Look, we could sit here and go on all night about English players that have gone down easy. I can name 100 of them. But it's not the truth. At the end of the day, it's not really what the topic is about. So for me, that's more of the discussion about making sure that the language that we use is correct. We just had today one of our legends talk about our striker, saying that he feels conned by him because he's not played well for the first 3 games, so he's not sure if he's a decent striker anymore. And he used the word conned. It was the wrong word. If you're a pundit, use the right word, for God's sake. That's your job. That's what you're there for. It doesn't matter whether you're it doesn't matter whether you are, you've been educated or not, or you've got an A level here, an A level there, or you're a footballer. Use the right language, because you're there to communicate to your audience. So it doesn't matter if you're a legend. You don't get carte blanche just because you're a legend to say anything you want. If you're communicating to a football audience, you have to tell them accurately what you're saying. And saying that you're conned by a player because they've had 2 or 3 bad games is absolutely the wrong language, because then that goes into social media and it becomes a thing. It lives on its own, and fans immediately say, well, maybe he's conning us. That's right, actually, you're right, Mr. Scholes, that's who it was.
The other angle is that I've seen another angle I've seen. Last point on this, guys, because we've got to move on. We've got 2 more questions, but what I saw regarding this comment was actually people made it like a xenophobic thing. They were saying, oh, well, he doesn't say anything against Rashford or Shaw, etc., but it's because Martial's French. There's a section of the fan base that think that. And that in itself is damaging as well, because it's just creating more divides.
Yeah, but because you leave it open to interpretation. So if you say conned, then people are going to say, well, why do you feel conned? Is it about football? What is it about? Now, I'm absolutely sure that Paul Scholes meant it about football. Totally. He's talking about it from a football angle. But then when you add up all the pieces, and we're talking about Martial's 3 performances this season, that's what he's basing it on. And last year he was saying he's a top-class striker. He scored more than 20 goals and got 12 assists and was absolutely in the elite category of numbers when we talk about the sport of scoring goals. Then how has it changed in 2 weeks of the new season? So this is what we're talking about. And so language does matter across a variety of subjects. And if you say that you feel conned by someone, you better back it up. Yeah, sure. Tell us why do you feel conned? Or you could just say he's not the right player for me. For me now, he's not the right player. I think that United should go and buy another striker because this striker is better. I think Haaland's more suited than Martial. You can say that, but say it in the correct way. When you start using divisive language and language that creates division, then people will question you, and rightfully so.
Yeah, well said. Ryan, I'm going to come to you for this next question. So we've spoken a little bit. Dan mentioned it earlier about those players that I think it might have been Rob actually, that didn't quite make a career in football. And then they get dropped by society. It's almost as if actually people are forgetting that whole group of people. Because as you say, it's a 0.05% that actually make it to the top of the game. But as you said earlier, those who who are younger, put all the eggs in one basket and don't make it, they're just cast aside, aren't they? And is that a societal problem? Are society doing enough to support them?
I think it's a bit of both. I think first and foremost, the club has a responsibility. Rob touched on it earlier. Unfortunately, players are just commodities, especially at that age. So they'd rather cast a net big enough for 200 young girls or boys in the hope to catch one superstar, and the others are just making up the numbers. And the sad part about it is there'll be coaches who know that a footballer at 15 isn't going to make it, but they'll string them along until they're 18 because they need a side. He's good enough to make up the numbers, but he's never going to be good enough for the first team. I also think there's probably a bit of an issue in this country with clubs hoarding players. So what we're seeing now is, I mean, we've both mentioned we're Tranmere fans. Tranmere have always had a relatively successful academy. And one of the reasons being is the Northwest is a hotbed for football. Same way Rochdale, Bury, Bolton have probably benefited from Manchester United and City's academy. Tranmere have always benefited from Everton and Liverpool. Now, we always benefited when we picked up players who were released maybe at 15, 16, spent 2 or 3 years with Tranmere, take a Jason Kumas, for example, and we're in the first team by 19, 20. Unfortunately, a club like Liverpool now will hold a player till he's 23, and they'll loan them out maybe once in that period, because what we're seeing now is managers don't want them to learn bad habits, play on worse pitches, play with worse players. So they're not scared. They're too scared to put them in the first team. They're not comfortable sending them out. And in the end, they just become a waste of talent. And not somebody who's 16, who's maybe a rough diamond, who someone can go and polish. He's someone who's 23, who's now going to be thrust into a man's game. He's only ever played under 23 football. And they're just not ready for it. And I think that's the kind of problem, that you've got to be honest and treat these people as humans and not just as commodities. I appreciate you can't dish out 20 contracts a year. Clubs would love to, but they can't. But equally, you've got to give them the best shot at life after your football club. And I don't think clubs do. I think that's where they let them down, where they string them along. I do think, again, like everything we've discussed tonight, we are trending in a better direction. We are seeing a lot more education. There's a lot more opportunity now for players abroad. You see a lot of players who take scholarships into the States. You see some people join. A lot of English lads are now going to Germany, as we're all very well aware, because the opportunity is better. So football growing globally will benefit these young players. But equally, there's only so many contracts. And I do think football has a responsibility to them as people before it does as footballers. And that's where it needs to catch up.
I think you make a really good point there, Ryan. I think we've spoken to a couple of people who kind of were on the cusp of making first teams and then haven't quite made it for I mean, normally it's injury, but there can be one reason or another. But I think what we kind of have to think about is that if you're somebody who's been in an academy system since you were sort of 7, 8, 9 years old, by the time you get to 17, 18, 19, where the point where you're no longer an academy player, you're going to be becoming a first team player. And if you get let go at that point, that's something that you've basically thought about doing for your whole life. Your entire life was fixated around. And we know it. You remember the kids that you were in school with that were in academies. I could reel them off now. There was 3 lads in my year who were in academies. None of them made it one of them made it as a footballer, but the other 2 didn't. And you just kind of there going, that's John who plays for Man United. That's Steve from Liverpool. That's Tony who plays for Everton. And that's their identity. Their identity is wrapped up in this whole thing of being a footballer. And all their self-esteem is wrapped up in it as well. And then literally they go from being Tony the footballer, John the footballer, Dave the footballer, to just Dave. Yeah. And footballers have to tackle at the end of the career. And it's hard enough when they're in their mid to late 30s. It's even more difficult when you're 17, 18. And people at that age struggle with their identity anyway. That's a big thing when you're obviously going from being a teenager into being an adult. Your identity is a really difficult thing to nail down. And when it's linked into your self-esteem, that's when stuff like anxiety and depression and things like that can just hit you so quickly, because you haven't got that basis to fall back on of, well, I want to be a footballer, but I'm not defined by being a footballer. But the environment is created such that you're going to be a footballer. You're going to be a footballer. That if the pinnacle of this everything is to be a footballer. Like, it'll be the best thing in the world. You have to work so hard. You have to give up everything to do it. And if you don't make it, how can people like that not feel like a failure? How can they not feel as though they've not, done the thing that they were meant to do? And there's so many people who just fall out of the game. And clubs, it's difficult for clubs because ultimately they can't look after everybody. But the game itself needs to be set up in a way that says to them that there'll be exit paths for them if they don't make it, and there'll be things for them afterwards, so that they'll soften that blow. Ryan mentioned the Tranmere College. When we spoke to Mike Kinsella, who's he kind of runs the college, he said that the way their attitude towards it is that they don't tell them they're going to be footballers. He said if they make it as footballers, then that's a bonus. But they don't. Their fixation is on the education and getting them to a point where if they become a footballer, that's just a bonus.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say about the education side of it, because that is all key. Now, when we talk about mental health, and we're talking about young guys going into, and young girls as well, going into this sport and finding a route into life. How do they find their own identity in their own space? And in football, there is this kind of all-encompassing thing that you have to be great, and if you're not great, then you're going to fall off the edge of the cliff, and that's it. But there's actually a much bigger story before all of that. We're talking about trying to make your way in life, and if education is not there and everything is just about kicking a ball around a football pitch, then the day it comes, and as we just said, it's the 0.01% who kind of get through the game and actually have a career out of it and can make some money from it and have a life, then what happens to everyone else? And it's those people that we need to look at and find paths for them and education, so they can look after themselves as well, so they know that there's support out there. And I think football clubs are better at it now, but only still at the top end. And when I say top end, I'm talking about the professional sport. Further down the pyramid where there's less resources, we're still just, you might play for your local team who are maybe a League Two team or a conference team or something like that. And if you don't make it, that's it. Goodbye. You're given your cards, you're told to leave, and you don't play for them ever again. What do we do with these people? So this has to try and find a kind of an answer for everyone, because it's still, it's definitely getting better, but it's
inconsistent, isn't it?
It's inconsistent. That's the word I'm trying to find. Yeah. You're right. It's not across the board. It's only really there at a certain level, and that's because the resources are different.
And I think that's inconsistency, particularly with mental health, is such an important word, because often these things kind of rely on the fact that if you are in a situation with if you have the right person who happens to be looking after you, you'll have a good experience. And if you're in a situation where you don't have the right person looking after you, you'll have a poor experience. Mm-hmm. And mental health's a massive part. I mean, I know two people who've been in hospital after attempted suicide, and one of them thought that the service that they got from the mental health team afterwards was great, and the other one thought it was terrible and thought they were just left to their own devices. And what will have happened is the person who thought it was great would have just happened to be under the care of someone who was really great at their job, and the other person will either have been not great or overworked or whatever was the problem. There's a systematic kind of failure in so much as it's inconsistent across the board, and it goes the same for football clubs as well. If you're in a football club that cares and has the right people in the right places, it'll go well for you. But do the FA or the EFL or the Premier League or any of these organisations, are they knocking on the door and going, "What are you doing? Like, what are you doing for these people? How are you helping them?" And they need to be doing that more to ensure that as employers of these people, that they're taking care of their well-being.
Yeah, it's got to be safeguarded in the same way you'd have Ofsted for a school, or you'd be audited as a care home or whatever it may be. It needs to be treated in the same way. As a live example, Man United did it absolutely brilliantly this year. When coronavirus hit, they refused to release any of the second-year scholars because that doesn't have to. I mean, some players, if you're going to make it as a professional footballer, there's an element of it that you have to do yourself, and you have to have the certain amount of ability. Yeah. But there was an example of a football club just doing the right thing by not leaving it to chance. They said, well, this isn't fair to release these players into the world during a pandemic when it's difficult to get jobs, when we haven't probably given them the opportunity that previous scholars have had. And it was quite an easy decision to make. It probably cost them maybe a couple £100,000 over the duration. But in terms of a club the size of Man United, it's, in my opinion, money well spent. And I think clubs don't always have to do these really radical things. They can be little changes, and as we said, it starts with caring, and that showed the compassionate side. Whoever made that decision at Man United made an absolutely brilliant decision, and I think clubs need to learn from that. It doesn't always have to be this new, innovative way of working. It can be just simply doing right by the people who you employ, and I think the more of that we see, the better it'll be for these players, and hopefully result in less ill mental health further down the road.
Yeah, well said, guys. Final question. I'm gonna start with you, Rob, because we're both United fans. Harry Maguire obviously suffered a very traumatic event this summer. I was speaking to Dan and Ryan about it off air, and something that Dan did say, I'll let him talk about it later, but in more depth, he said, if that was one of your mates who'd gone through that ordeal, you'd be like, are you all right? You'd be really concerned. But it does seem to me, from what we've seen on Twitter, I know you've had a few discussions with people on Twitter about it, fans have completely disregarded that as if that never really happened, just in the distant past. And they just sort of show that the stigma's still there with mental health or effects of a traumatic experience. I mean, it could even be something like PTSD. Obviously, we can't go and diagnose these things without knowing all the facts. But Harry Maguire is not right. We're United fans. We've seen him. He does not look okay. His performances are alarmingly poor. He's in the spotlight at probably one of the biggest clubs in the world as captain. And it seems to me a lot of fans have just dismissed the mental impact of that event.
Yeah, I think first of all, it's really important to point out that Harry Maguire hasn't spoken about his mental health. So everything we talk about when it comes to him is presumed. We're only looking and observing. I think ultimately, if you've been through something as harrowing as that he's been through, where he thought he was going to lose his life, he admitted that, he said that in his BBC interview, and he also has been under the trauma of possibly going to jail for it, for the incident. That is a really difficult thing for anyone to handle. Doesn't matter whether you're clever, intelligent, thick, doesn't matter whatever you want to be described as. Ultimately, that is a really emotional thing to go through. And it can only impact your mental health. It must have some impact on you, would any one of us. And that hasn't been taken into account, certainly with his football. And, we know he's not played well for United this season. We know he looks different. And when I say that, you can see that maybe in his demeanor that, he looks a little bit withdrawn. But this is our assessment, my assessment as a football journalist looking at a player. But there's been no kind of, I don't know what's the word is, there's been no sympathy towards what he's been through. What you do find is a lot of fans saying, well, he deserves it. Well, he was a part of it, so he deserves it. He deserves everything he gets. And then you get other fans who are kind of the complete, opposite side of it, and they just look at the game and they just go, well, he's not playing well, so I don't care. So there's no empathy on either side of the kind of the opinion when it comes to, especially when it comes to Twitter. And I think, unfortunately, now we live in this world where social media drives absolutely everything, both our normal media and all of our lives. We got our news from Twitter, and we're getting our news from sources that are not trusted. It's not the truth. It's just they're not real sources, some of them. And when it comes to football, it's really, really tough to kind of listen to some of it, because some of the things that I've heard from pundits about Harry Maguire just kind of make me cringe, because there's no empathy in what they're saying. It's just purely about the way he kicks the ball around the pitch. So I think it's really difficult for Harry Maguire. I would have liked to see Manchester United take him out the firing line. I don't think anyone under those kind of pressures should be working, because again, would you send someone to an office to go and work like that if you wanted them to perform at their best? I don't know if you would. You would consider taking them out the firing line. But when you're at Manchester United, you're a world record defender. You're the captain of the football club. The temptation from both club and player is to get on a pitch. That's the bottom dollar, because it's the financial side of it. It's the glory. It's Manchester United. You're in the spotlight. As I said the other day, the other flip side of that now is if Ole did take him out the team, everyone would say that's an advocation of his performances and say, well, he's not good enough. So that's why they're taking him out of the team. So I think for United, they have tried to protect Maguire through this whole period. And they've done that consistently with players for the last 20 or 30 years, all the way back into Fergie's tenure. And they've tried to do the right thing. But I think maybe he shouldn't be on a football pitch at the moment for his own mental health.
I think it just extends to that sort of thing where footballers on, especially at the top level, aren't seen as human beings. They're not portrayed as human beings. They're not treated like human beings. The standards that we expect from them, the kind of the royal way, that the way that they're expected to live their lives, the way they're expected to behave, the way they're expected to talk, the way they're expected to look and perform at all times.
Yeah, they're racehorses.
Yeah,
racehorses. That's how they're treated. They're like really great animals that can jump hurdles.
Yeah.
So you just, you pat them, you look after them, you feed them, and go and get out there and jump.
Yeah,
that's kind of
and
how
I think
we look at them.
It's like twofold, really. I think you watch Sky Sports, and just before a game or highlights for the game or whatever it might be, and it involves a slow motion replay of a footballer who's running arms outstretched in the rain, looking like an absolute Adonis, normally with thousands of people screaming their head off behind them, jumping up and down. And you think you portraying them like they're the Avengers. You're not portraying them like they're normal people. And I get why it's done like that. But you can't be surprised that when people are portrayed in that manner, that they're not also treated like human beings, like you and I would be. If you think about, imagine you'd gone through the thing that he's gone through, as you say, Rob. There, he genuinely thought he might lose his life. His sister was in what he perceived, or what might have been, a really, really genuinely chaotic and dangerous position. He's done it all in the public eye. He also faced going to prison. At the same time, he was also having questions about whether he should be in the England squad, whether he should still be Man United captain, is he still going to be able to do his job properly, all that sort of stuff. And then he goes to work. He's not quite performing the same way he was at work. If it was in your work, if you went into an office, as you say, and someone was just, they weren't quite themselves, and the reaction was for people to go, he's shit, isn't he? He's shit at his job. Isn't he proper shit? Should we just sack him and get somebody else in to do his job? You'd be like, can someone phone a union at this point? Because this is just out of order. But because they're footballers, it's like, oh, well, he gets paid however much, so he should be fine. And you think, you can't just swallow a £10 note and that makes him feel better.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He's a human being. He's gone through an incredibly traumatic thing. He might be the person who's pushing to play. That might be what he wants to do. But I think that the football club should take his well-being into account and make the decision themselves and say, we don't think that it's right for you to be working at this time, whether or not you think that it is. And we're going to take care of you by removing you from the firing line. And I get why it's a difficult position, but ultimately, if he's not right, he's not right. And that's not going to benefit anybody for him to just continually be put out there.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think people think money's a shield, and it isn't. And if you put the historical context into Harry Maguire's last 4 years, he played every minute for Leicester 17-18. He then goes to the World Cup, to which England get to the third and fourth playoff, if you want to take it to the last game. Then has a small break then. Then he has another season at Leicester. Then he joins the biggest club in the world for the largest fee for a defender. Then we have coronavirus.
He didn't get to Liverpool, did he?
He played every minute for United last year as well. Every
minute for United. And then he couldn't. Historically, footballers have always had a relatively decent break, and that break's disappearing over the years with extra tournaments or trips to America or to the Middle East to have a game of football. And I think the players are genuinely burnt out, and when your body's tired and when you're physically tired, you're mentally tired as well. So to have that on top, and then within a couple of hours of that news breaking, for your phone to be buzzing and there's different gifts and there's different jokes about him, for him and his family, that is extremely traumatic, because everything these footballers do is put under a microscope, and they're not allowed to live their lives and be Harry Maguire the person. He's always Harry Maguire the footballer. And lo and behold, you see it as well, at how funny individuals are, that they'll give somebody as much stick as they want. They'll call them all sorts. But if any footballer on Twitter has a little laugh back or makes a joke back to a normal or an ordinary person, we'll call them, everyone's like, how dare they speak to me like that? He's got no right. You think, look what you've just said to him as a person, as an individual, and then think about it when you're offended when they say something back. It's just
right. Some of the stuff that I've seen on Maguire, and Rob, you'll know this. You're on football, Man United football Twitter. It is actually disgusting. And it's not even talking about his performances. I mean, it's pretty bad anyway. It's overreaction. Worst ever captain at United. Worst ever signing. All this rubbish. It's not true. But it even goes to his appearance. You know, obviously the slab head. I don't like when people call him slab head. I mean, I always thought it. Obviously, they're talking about it because of his ability at heading the ball. But people are using now that as like an insult for the way he looks. and Rob, you'll see this. His mum, his sister's not so much anymore. His mum is very active on Twitter. Always see her tweeting like "Good luck, Harry." Haven't seen her at all. Imagine your mum seeing random people abuse you on Twitter. You just got to think about. Yeah, but your mum.
My mum does see people abuse me on Twitter and go, "What's going on there?" It does happen, and I'm no one. So this is the thing. It's for players, the kind of volume that they get in terms of the abuse is incredible because it's so amplified. And even someone like I've got 21,000 followers on Twitter through my work. I get called all sorts of names. Someone tweets me every day and says that I'm bald. All sorts of stuff, and we can kind of have a brush it off because it doesn't mean anything to me. But you're right, in terms of physical appearance and stuff like that, Harry Maguire's had the whole spectrum. And you know what? If you're black, you get it even worse, because then you get the racism on top of it as well. So this is what happens all the time. And I think for Harry Maguire, I think the bigger picture is the kind of abuse that his family have suffered off the back of this, because this was a family event. It wasn't just Harry Maguire, out on his own with a mate. This something that happened to his whole family, while he was out there in Greece. And that's something he's having to manage because he's the guy who's famous. He's the guy that people are interested in. And he's the guy whose performance will be assessed continually game to game to game to game. And we'll probably be talking about this still in a year's time. We'll either be saying, yep, he recovered and he did well, and that's that. Or we'll be saying, no, he got worse. He got dropped. He's out the team. Oh, Man United have sold him now. For him, the story continues. And that's a really difficult weight to carry for any individual. I always say to people, with Twitter and things like that, turn it off. If it hurts you, you've got to turn it off, because if you're part of that ecosystem, you're in trouble. But, I know people that know Caroline Flack, yeah, and what she went through in the final year before she committed suicide. And they're all devastated because all of her friends obviously saw what happened to her. And she lost her life because of it, partly because of the media attention and how it was pushed forward, but a lot to do with social media and how you feel when you read one of those tweets. And every now and then, one of them does get to you. Even for me, I feel like I'm bulletproof to most of it. But every now and then, someone will say something and it will just kind of pinch, and you kind of think, turn it off. But for footballers, it's really, really difficult because social media is part of their world, part of their branding, and they're all in the thick of it. There's 2 or 3 footballers I know who are not on social media at all. No Instagram, no Facebook, no Twitter. And those few are very, very happy individuals. They're just not interested in it, and they are happy just to stay away and to be private and just go and do their jobs on the pitch. But that's not the norm. Most players are part of that world.
Kader, Rob, can I ask you both a question then as United fans? So it's probably a little bit different for me and Dan, because we tend to have quite a lot of respect for the likes of Harry Maguire because we've seen them in the lower league. So I've seen Harry Maguire at 20 play at Prenton Park for Sheffield United. We've seen Jamie Vardy come through. We saw Dele Alli when he was at MK Dons. So for us, we would never really be like they're rubbish at football, because they've gone from playing our local team to playing for England and those type of things. And with Tranmere fans and with lower league fans, we often argue amongst each other from difference of opinion, which is natural. But for Man United fans, and it's same with Liverpool and City and all the other big clubs, is you have a lot of people on social media who claim to represent the club and claims to be fans of the club, but they're faceless. No one's ever seen them. They might have never been to a game. They've got Man United logo as the badge. They've got #MUFC, and they have outlandish opinions. And that gets caught up in the whole sphere of being Manchester United, and it gets caught up in the football ecosystem, as you've touched on. But they don't, by any stretch of the imagination, really support the football club. So how do you sort of differentiate the actual United fans, the sort of wannabe United fans, and how do you sort of sieve through all of that? Because it must be a bit of a mess when it all comes together online.
Do you want me to take this one first, Rob?
Yeah, go for it.
Look, let's just look at the United fan base, right? So I spoke to someone the other day, and we actually differentiate different groups within the United fan base. You've got the love United, hate Glazers, which has become anything but that. They now hate United, and they abuse, and remember Max Taylor? Do you remember him, Rob, the player that overcame cancer in the academy? Yeah, you remember that? I saw comments basically going in on him about his cancer, saying it's not even a big deal and things like that. Discussing comments. Then you've got those that love Jose Mourinho, and they'll make that well known. You've got those that obviously consider themselves. Look, I'm not from Manchester, and I've had a lot of things said to me. Oh, why are you doing a podcast about United? You're not from Manchester, so you get that. I have had that from people that live in Manchester or who are Mancunian. They're considered top Reds, I would say. And then there's a group of people who are overseas, obviously, and these are very, very committed people that get up at 4 a.m. to watch United play. They won't miss a game. And what I've found personally is the ones who have bigger followings will just pander to what they think will get them more clicks, more likes, more retweets. That's my sort of impression of it. And there are fans. I mean, we were talking about this yesterday, Rob. And there are fans that actually probably don't really support United, but they see United as a way to up their profile, see as a way to perhaps get a different job. And unfortunately, I think you can't turn around to someone and say you're not a real United fan. I think if you want United to lose, as me and Rob were talking about the other day, then you can. But unfortunately, when you've got a club that obviously at that stature and the fan base that big, you're never going to have a United fan base. And there's nothing really you can do. All you can do is try and be measured, try and be reasonable, try and be objective. But being a United fan at the moment is, I think last 7 years have been difficult. But at the moment, I found it very, very difficult. I wake up, go on Twitter, and it's just bullshit. And it's difficult.
Yeah, I called it the other day the collective neurosis of Manchester United fans, because that's where we are with United, as a supporter base. The fans hate the owners, the fans hate the football, the fans hate the players. They don't want the manager, they don't want anything. They're just in a really bad place. So when you start and you look at the fan base and say, right, what is a Manchester United fan? Like you just said there, Hader, it's exactly the same. There's guys in Australia who get up in the middle of the night, and guys in America who, across the world who are committed as any fan. I say myself, I'm a Boston Celtics fan. I love the NBA. I'm up at 3 a.m. watching games and it kills me. Yeah, but it's part of my life. I love the team and I follow them. So I empathize with United fans that do the same. However, the problem is with social media, if you just use someone's profile or their words or their tweets to define whether they're a good fan or not, then it's pointless. It's pointless because you can't define it because it's hot air. It is just this echo chamber that goes on and on forever. And the best thing to do, I always say to people, to not ignore it, because I'm part of football Twitter. I have my opinions and people respond. Don't have notifications. Don't be part of that ecosystem. Just get it out your life, dip in when you want and dip out. And then you don't see most of it. And I'm like that. People say, oh, did you see this when these went off with these United fans? And I'm quite often like, no, because I'm not interested. So I just turn it off. And that's the best advice I give to anyone. We don't need to judge whether someone loves United or not. We can't judge that at the end of the day. I go to the games. I love United. I'm a journalist. I feel very privileged that I get to do that. And there's lots of people that don't. But I'm not a better fan than anyone else. And I don't think we should look at it like that. And it's difficult for a club like ours because we are one of the biggest clubs in the world, 1 billion fans. How do you decipher down 1 billion fans? Can't sieve that down, can you? It's impossible. So it is what it is, and I think we just have to accept it. And if United started winning tomorrow, look at all these Liverpool fans that are suddenly all very happy. Yeah, these Liverpool fans have been a 30 years, neurosis of going around in circle with not winning, and I think that's connected quite often with fan bases. And United fans are there now, because we're not winning. And if they started to collect a few trophies, if United won the Premier League this year, I think suddenly people would be a lot happier on Twitter.
Yeah,
maybe.
That's a good point, guys.
It shouldn't just be connected to winning, but it is, unfortunately, a lot, especially when we talk about Twitter.
Yeah, I completely agree. Look, I know, Ryan, you've got to put your boots on. You're going to be playing football in the. So it's been absolutely fantastic, guys. Dan, thank you very much. I've honestly learned so much. I might have been a bit quiet, but I'm just absorbing it all in because, there's so many facets to the conversation which I've never even thought about. So, Dan, thank you very much for coming on, mate.
No, thanks for asking us, mate. It's been really enjoyable. It's been nice to, as you say, put a face to the name. Same for yourself, Rob. It's been really nice speaking to you.
Absolutely. Ryan, thank you, mate. It's really good to see you. I haven't spoken to you, obviously, for a long time. I'll ask you, where can the listeners find your podcast and any of your articles or information that you guys tweet about?
Our Twitter is @Markin_man. And the podcast, you can find it on all the usual places: Google, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the rest of it. Come and get involved. Come and use the hashtag Where's the Talking, lads. And there's loads of stuff on there for you to come and get involved in.
Awesome. And Rob, as always, thank you very much. And thank you for your insight. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, mate.
No problem at all.
Cheers,
and guys,
I'll have a listen to your podcast.
Oh,
Yeah.
nice one, Rob. Cheers, mate.
What we'll do is we'll chuck that into the description. Guys, make sure you hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. As you can see, Ryan's been the unlucky one that's hiding behind the like and subscribe. There's always someone every single week. So his name is actually Ryan, but we'll put his handle in the description as well. And make sure you check us out on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well, because we are also uploading the audio versions and it's much easier to listen to than YouTube. You can obviously, flick around on your phone while you listen to it. But yeah, thank you.